Well, here's a creepy story. Did John Lennon sell his soul to the devil in exchange for fame and fortune in his hometown of Liverpool, England? It's said that there is a bridge in the Mossley Hill district in Liverpool which has a history of soul exchanges. The bridge goes over the railroad tracks leading to and from Mossley Hill Station. One such story takes place in the late 1950s. A Woolton man with the last name James lost his life savings in a failed business venture. He considered killing himself in Sefton Park with a pistol. He had written a suicide note to his estranged wife, and he went to the park with his revolver. James put the gun to his head but couldn't pull the trigger. He decided to leave the park and wander the streets. He ended up at a pub called the Rose of Mossley, which is located where Rose Lane and Ridge Road meet. While at the bar, Mr. James overheard an interesting conversation between two old men. They were talking of a soldier who had returned home after World War II. On his return, he found his wife had left him. Then he became ill and suffered from tuberculosis. His condition got worse, so he went to the bridge at midnight to sell his soul. The devil appeared, and the soldier exchanged his soul for 20 years of excellent health and great wealth. He was now a successful businessman living in Caldy. Mr. James approached the two old men. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about the soldier," he said to the men. Then he asked them where he could find the bridge. The two men tried to discourage him, telling him it was just a story, a nonsense rumor. Mr. James still wanted to know where the bridge in question was. One of the old men took him to the door of the pub and pointed to it. "There, that's it," said the old man. James lingered around until midnight came, and then he made his way to the bridge. As he stood on the bridge, waiting for the devil to appear, but no one showed. "If you can hear me, give me a sign," Mr. James whispered, "because I want to do a deal with you. Make me rich again for 20 years, and you can have my soul in return." A little mongrel dog came trotting along the bridge. It stopped a few feet from Mr. James, who thought the animal might be the devil in disguise. "Is it you?" he asked the dog, and it barked ferociously at the failed businessman. Then a shadow of a man's head and shoulders slid across the wall of the bridge, and Mr. James turned to see what the dog was barking at. It was a silhouette of a man with horns, and he was well over normal height. Mr. James estimated the entity was at least 6 feet 5 inches in height. He wore a long black coat that went down to his knees, and his shoes looked like turned-up Persian slippers. The wide staring eyes radiated pure menace. His rich voice said, "20 years of wealth I will give you in return for your soul. Do you agree to these terms?" Mr. James was trembling. He nodded. The mongrel bolted off down the bridge into the night. "Then say you agree to them," the devil prompted him. "I agree to these terms," Mr. James said, but his voice was barely audible because his throat had closed up in tear. "So be it, and then I shall collect what is mine." The devil then turned around, but as his back was presented to Mr. James, he vanished instantly. An aroma reminiscent of roasted pork filled the air. Overnight, the fortunes of Mr. James reversed. 3 days after the deal was struck with the devil, Mr. James received a windfall when his premium saving bonds were chosen by Ernie, the electronic random number generator at Lintham St. Anne's, Lancashire. Mr. James' wife returned to him, and after taking her out for a meal one night, they went to a bingo hall. Mr. James won £400. He went into the scrap metal business and made so much money he sold this business a year later and ventured into the property market. Mr. James prospered in every sphere of business and was either envied or admired by his rivals. A businessman who planned a groundless smear campaign against Mr. James involving falsified documents died in a horrific car crash, and another man who tried to set fire to a factory belonging to Mr. James accidentally burnt himself to death. Mr. James confided to his best friend that his outstanding success in all fields was due to him selling his soul to the devil, and he advised his lifelong companion to follow in his footsteps. His shocked and appalled friend then abandoned him. The story goes that in the late 1970s, Mr. James lost his wife, and then one by one his businesses went bankrupt. His health went into rapid decline, and Mr. James realized his time was up. He intended to return to Jesus because he feared his time was up, and that the devil would soon be calling to collect his soul. Mr. James suffered a heart attack, and the ambulance taking him to Sefton General passed over the bridge in Mossley Hill, where the diabolical deal had been struck 20 years before, and a strange darkness filled the interior of the ambulance. The eyes of Mr. James bulged in terror, and he passed away at that point. He was declared dead on arrival at the hospital on Smithdown Road. There's also a hoary old tale of a young, hopeless musician who sold his soul to the devil on the bridge of Rose Lane in December of 1960. So this tale goes, John Lennon, aged 20, had heard the weird tales of the Devil's Bridge and became obsessed with the idea of selling his soul to Beelzebub in return for fame and fortune, as he wanted to be bigger than his idol, Elvis Presley, a performer who had ironically been accused of being in league with the devil and playing the fiend's music, rock and roll. Lennon sneaked out of his house, 251 Minlove Avenue, where he was living with Aunt Mimi, and walked just over a mile through the December snow to the Bridge of Destiny, arriving there just before midnight. The devil dully appeared as a tall, shadowy figure with horns and the same uncanny-looking eyes described by Mr. James. A bargain was struck. Within 3 years, millions upon millions of people would idolize Lennon and the rest of his band, the Beatles. They broke all record sales with their songs, and their success would be unprecedented. The band would be seemingly surrounded with an aura that caused the youth of the day to erupt into an ecstatic frenzy known as Beatlemania, a term first coined by Professor Rex Macon, a close friend of Beatles manager Brian Epstein. Then there were the curious digs John Lennon had at Christianity, Jesus and his disciples. In 1966, Lennon quipped that the Beatles were now bigger than Christ, and he called the disciples of Jesus thick. Christianity will go, John told a reporter. It'll vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. Around this time, a musician who was in awe of the global following enjoyed by the Beatles asked John how he could account for his stratospheric success, and the reply he received was probably tongue-in-cheek. I sold my soul to the devil, John told him calmly. But was this just one of those tongue-in-cheek remarks John was famous for? Personally, I believe the success of the Beatles can be explained through a number of mundane factors. They were an exceedingly skilled ensemble of musicians who had earned their apprenticeship with grueling sessions in Hamburg, and both Lennon and McCartney were truly phenomenal songwriters, as Harrison was in later years when he was given a chance to shine. Brian Epstein was an extraordinary manager who also shaped the popular image of the Fab Four, and George Martin was nothing short of a genius producer, a true fifth Beatle in fact. Then the timing was right. The 60s itself was the other hidden ingredient which set the stage for the revolutionary music of the Beatles. Without a doubt, there was a mass change in the collective consciousness of the planet at the beginning of that momentous decade. The music of the Beatles was like nothing that had ever been heard before. Lennon once said, before Elvis there was nothing. But many Beatles fans the world over would say that before the Beatles there was nothing. Popular music was a wasteland, and some believe that the popular music scene has returned to a state of stagnancy in recent times. Still, the dark legend of Lennon's pact with the devil continues to do the rounds. Some who believe in the story will cite strange incidents that seem to suggest that there was some supernatural genius of the Beatles. Take, for example, the cryptic onstage remark John Lennon made after the death of his best friend, artist Stuart Sutcliffe, on Wednesday, 11th of April, 1962. John told the audience in Hamburg, "Stuart Sutcliffe was a special human being and a remarkable man. He once told me that he had the ability to see into the future, and I, for one, now believe that Stu was telling the truth." What had happened to convince Lennon that Stu had the gift of premonition? There were rumors that Stu had told John that the Beatles would be bigger than anyone, even Elvis. Sutcliffe had, however, possibly predicted that he would never see that success, for he would tragically die, aged 21. The legend of the pact between Lennon and the fallen angel ends with the world-famous rock star being gunned down outside the Dakota apartments on the night of December 8th, 1980, exactly 20 years after the deal with the devil, when the 2 decades of world fame and super fortune expire. If John Lennon had really sold his soul to the devil, why on earth was he a committed campaigner for world peace during his lifetime? Furthermore, I would imagine that people who had given their souls to Satan would not be able to return from hell to be seen as ghosts after death. But there have been a report of John Lennon's ghost being seen across the city since his physical death in 1980. Most of these sightings are of a Lennon in his prime, dressed in the iconic white suit we would associate with the Abbey Road record cover. Many of the sightings center around Mendips, Lennon's home on Menlove Avenue, from the age of 5 until the age of 23, when world fame beckoned. Several of the sightings have been of John with a woman identified by some as his beloved Aunt Mimi. In 1998, a Woolton man named Frank Johnson told me that he was walking his dog along Beaconsfield Road, just around the corner from Mendips, when his dog suddenly crouched on the floor and refused to go any further. This was at 9:45 p.m. on a summer's evening at the gates of Strawberry Field, immortalized in the 1967 song by Lennon and McCartney. Frank happened to gaze beyond the red gates of the former orphanage, and there was a man who was unmistakably John Lennon with his trademark glasses, long hair, but clean shaven, looking about 30. He wore a white suit and stood there with his arms folded, gazing with Frank with a bemused look. Standing next to Lennon's ghost was a woman who looked as if she was in her 50s, or perhaps older, but she turned away and said something that Frank couldn't make out. Frank was so afraid he picked up his dog, an overfed Labrador, and carried him away from the poorly lit stretch of Beaconsfield Road. When he got home, Frank said to his wife, "I've just seen a ghost in Strawberry Field." And he expected his wife Linda to doubt his words, but instead she looked at him with a somber expression and said, "I've seen 2 of them a few times. Did he have a white suit on?" Frank was flabbergasted. He had been a Beatles fan in his youth, but his wife, being in her late 20s, had never really been that interested in the Beatles and had not recognized Lennon's ghost. Linda said she had seen the ghost walk straight through the closed gates of Strawberry Field a fortnight ago, but had said nothing, as she's been brought up to believe that only bad luck would be had from talking about such things. About a month before that, Linda had seen the man in the white suit reading graffiti left by Beatles fans on the gates of Strawberry Field, and when she walked past with the dog, he vanished before her eyes. These are just a couple of sightings of Lennon's ghost. Here's another story where Lennon is referenced again, and Rose Lane. One day in 1953, or so the story goes, 3 13-year-old local lads named Kenny, Bobby, and Johnny were playing cricket in the park when a vagrant spoiled their game by catching the old scuffed tennis ball after Johnny had hit it for a 6. The old man beckoned the boys to the nearby bridge on Rose Lane, which looked down onto a long railway track. The vagrant saw the plume of steam from an approaching locomotive in the distance and told the boys that he would throw the ball down the funnel of the train as it was about to pass under the bridge. An instant later, when the train emerged from the other side of the bridge, the force of the escaping steam from the funnel would send the tennis ball skywards, and whoever caught it on the bridge would one day become the most famous man in the world. The elderly tramp managed to hurl the ball into the locomotive's funnel as it thundered below the bridge, and the ball was indeed propelled by a jet of steam high into the air a split second later on the other side of the bridge. Johnny caught it, but Kenny and Bobby asked how Johnny Lennon could ever become the most famous man in the world. So what do you think? Did John Lennon sell his soul? You decide.